June 1941. Kymi Airfield finish Brewster B-239 seconds, lift into a narrow front where pilot continuity, austere tactics, and meticulous maintenance turned an average airframe into an outlier of claimed effectiveness. June 1941. Kymi Airfield starting conditions and the constrained theater. The continuation war's opening week set a precise frame for the Brewster story. A short front from the Gulf of Finland through the Karelian Isthmus to Ladoga, where Finnish air units operated from dispersed, tree-lined fields and met VVS formations inbound to Leningrad and the Karelian rail corridors. LeLv 24, the primary Brewster B-239 unit, entered operations with approximately 40 serviceable airframes, uncertain 44, and a corps of pre-war pilots who had trained together since the late 1930s. The B-239 itself, an export derivative of the U.S. Navy's F-2A, arrived in Finland, stripped of naval gear, yielding an empty weight reduction on the order of 250-300 kilograms, and retaining a Wright R-1820 radial rated around 900-1000 HP, uncertain, variant, specific power ratings. In a theater where typical interception altitudes sat near 1-4 kilometers and fight durations could be under 15 minutes, that modest power-to-weight improvement mattered. On Day 1 tasks, Finnish Doctrine emphasized early warning, small element tactics, and strict radio discipline. Controllers used ground observers and sound locators in 1941, then radar input later, to cue pairs or fours into climb positions. The early sorties show the quantitative frame. LeLv 24's first operational month saw dozens of scrambles, uncertain, ~60-90, with average mission durations near 45-70 minutes due to short legs between bases and front. Ammunition loads 412. 7mm guns on most Finnish B-239 seconds were rationed by Doctrine. While exact rounds per claim cannot be pinned to a single figure, a safe range in source notes spans from short bursts under 200 rounds to full belts expended in multi-contact sorties. Uncertain, documentation varies by pilot log. Average engagement altitudes clustered around 1.53 kilometers in 1941, rising during 1942-43 as VVS escorts gained confidence and numbers. The pilot continuity piece appears immediately. Finnish policy avoided rapid rotation. Line pilots often remained within the same squadron for many months, sometimes years, building repeated familiarity with terrain, routes, and the same set of opponents. Eino Ilmari Juutilainen, who would ultimately be credited in Finnish records with over 90 victories across types, embodies the pattern. In his wartime notes, he stressed energy control and firing discipline. No unnecessary turns. Fire only when certain, paraphrase of diary extracts. Source, Juutilainen's memoir and diary references. That mantra sat inside a broader tactical template. Elements climbed to standoff positions and attacked from advantage, avoiding low-speed angle fights where the Brewster's average wing loading and limited sustained climb would show. Maintenance adaptations were an equally concrete lever. Finnish ground crews, working with limited spares, implemented careful engine hour tracking and conservative power settings to extend time between overhaul. While precise TBO figures for the Wright R-1820 820 inches Finnish service vary by source and year, uncertain, to 200-300 engine hours between major overhauls under Finnish practices, the operational effect is visible in sortie rates. LeLv 24's B-239 seconds maintained monthly sortie counts in the dozens per airframe during 1941-42, with frontline serviceability reportedly hovering in the 70-85% range during calm periods, uncertain. Spikes down during mud seasons and during the 1944 summer. Cold weather cut both ways. Winter decreased VVS operational tempo on poor strip days, but imposed preheat penalties on Finnish radials. The Finns countered with engine tents, fuel heating, and strict warm-up cycles, adding minutes to each scramble but reducing cold start wear. Claims in 1941-42 show the headline asymmetry. Finnish victory credits in LeLv 24 ramp from the opening phase, with several aces emerging in the Brewster cadre. Kari Stenman's archival compilations emphasize not only pilot skill but system effects, alerting nets, base proximity, and stable flight leads as central to the high claim-to-loss ratios. Paraphrase. Stenman, multiple flumes on Finnish fighter units. Soviet documentation, however, records lower losses in many of the same engagements, and in some cases disputes the timing or type of the aircraft claimed. That divergence persists throughout the war. Our loss registers do not always match enemy claims. Notes: 1 VVS After-Action Digest from the Leningrad sector. Paraphrase. Soviet reports 1941-42. A reminder that archival reconciliation must consider damaged versus destroyed categorizations, aircraft written off later, and unit-level reporting lags measured in days. Two metrics illuminate the theater constraint. First, the runway spacing and fuel logistics kept turn, around times compact, enabling 2 to 4 sorties per pilot on peak days. Second, the front's narrowness meant that interceptions often occurred within 30-70 kilometers of base, compressing transit but risking rapid Soviet counterpresence. The Brewster's comparatively benign handling and good visibility aided novice to competent pilot transitions, but the Finnish edge lay in the longer arc experienced leaders flying with the same wingmen over the same forests and lakes. Continuity is a force multiplier. A Finnish staff note summarized in 1942 paraphrase, staff circulars, and the war diary entries reflect that idea. In practice, fewer rotations, repeated instructors, and codified debriefs that turned every contact into a lesson. In June 1941, the Finnish Brewster units entered a tightly bounded battle space, where base proximity, pilot continuity, and disciplined tactics amplified a modest airframe. Early claim asymmetries appear immediately, but the record also shows from the start that verification would be contested and must be cross-checked against VVS documentation. July-December 1941 Ladoga sector codifying doctrine and early claim patterns. By midsummer 1941, LeLv 24's Brewsters were flying in a rhythm that reflected the theater's constraints and the unit's continuity. The sector from Viapuri up past Lake Ladoga produced daily alerts as VVS formations pressed reconnaissance and interdiction along the rail lines and road nets toward Leningrad. Finnish controllers funneled pairs and fours to meet incoming tracks at 14 kilometers, a band that balanced the B-239's climb profile with available warning time. The squadron diary for late July shows repeated pair-led sorties with average airborne times in the 40-65 minute range. Uncertain. Flight log compilations vary by pilot, favoring short climbs to a position roughly 20-40 kilometers from base. In this phase, sortie density, roughly 2-3 per pilot, on busier days, interacted with maintenance discipline. Engine hour logs were kept to the minute, and ground crews rotated guns and inspected feed chutes to minimize stoppages that could squander carefully rationed ammunition. Standard Finnish fit was 412. 7mm guns. Per gun ammunition loads are variably recorded. Uncertain, 200-400 rounds per gun. But Doctrine prioritized short-aimed bursts at convergence distances set by the pilot, often in the 150-250 meters bracket. The tactical core hardened into procedure. Elements climbed offset from the expected approach vector, rolled in from high 2 or 4 o'clock, and disengaged rather than spiral into drag-inducing turn fights. "Do not accept the horizontal," reads a line attributed to Eino Ilmari Jutalainen's notes from the autumn, a distilled summary of energy fight preferences in an airframe that rewarded smooth, unloaded maneuvers. Paraphrase 1941 diary extracts. Wingmen were often the same week to week, preserving mutual cues and role clarity. The continuity shows up in the numbers. Through September 1941, a subset of LeLv 24's pilots flew well over 30-40 sorties each, uncertain, range by pilot, compared with the more rotational patterns seen in many VVS units pulled between sectors. Finnish after-action forms logged engagement entry speeds, often 300, 380 kilometers per hour, indicated at 2-3 kilometers, and firing durations, frequently as less than 2 seconds per pass. Data used in evening debriefs that were codified into squadron-level guidance. Claim accounting, a persistent historiographical pressure point, settled into a multi-step method. Finnish procedures typically required corroboration by a wingman, gun camera film where available, inconsistent in 1941, ground witness, or wreckage confirmation. Even with these hurdles, claim-to-loss ratios reported by LeLv 24 inches the second half of 1941 are striking in Finnish summaries. Kari Stenman's compilations emphasize both the tactical geometry and the front's geography, short transits, familiar terrain features, and a rising cadre of leaders as drivers of high claims per combat hour. Paraphrase, Stenman, Archival Series. Soviet documents from the northern divided by Leningrad sectors, however, record fewer losses for many of the same dates. Some of this gap is definitional damaged versus destroyed, aircraft belly, landed and written off later, multiple units claiming the same wreck. Some is temporal. Reports sometimes closed at week's end, while Finnish claims were logged same day. A translated VVS digest from late 1941 notes tersely. Enemy fighters avoid lengthy pursuit. Our escorts were insufficient for the day's assignments. Paraphrase. Leningrad Sector Report. End of Sector Report. That line aligns with Finnish reports of selective engagement attack, break, reclimb, rather than attritional turning fights that risked engine temperatures and ammunition depletion. The Brewster's weight-reduced Finnish configuration continued to matter in this period's specific engagements. Empty weight reductions on the order of to 250-300 kilograms relative to naval standard F2A loads kept wing loading and climb in a survivable bracket for 1-4 kilometers fights, particularly as autumn weather lowered cloud bases. Operational availability remained a constant concern. Serviceability percentages around 70–85% in quiet weeks dipped during rain and freeze events that complicated field drainage and braking, uncertain. Episodic logs. Ground crews introduced small but telling adaptations, engine tents, oil preheat routines, and snow berm management to keep debris ingestion low on the R-1820's forward-facing intake. Those routines preserved time between overhaul in the rough range of 200–300 hours under Finnish practices, uncertain, year and engine variant dependent, and enabled the squadron to keep multiple aircraft at quick readiness, often 15-minute alert windows when VVS activity spiked. Pilot continuity versus rotation emerges as a central axis in late 1941. The Finnish approach extended tenures in the same unit, same bases, same flight leads, functioned as a learning engine. Aces like Hans Wind began to accumulate credits in the Brewster cadre in this phase, often flying as lead with a consistent wingman structure. The contrast with many Soviet units, some experiencing losses, re-equipment, and redeployment, produced a timeline in which Finnish crews exploited predictability. The brief is brief, the debrief is long. A line remembered in squadron culture, emphasized structured lessons learned after each contact. Paraphrase, squadron debrief notes. Quantitatively, that meant iterative tuning of convergence settings. For example, 200 meters to 250 meters, attack angles, steeper rolls when escorts appeared, and climb schedules, targeting 3 kilometers entry when warning time permitted. Each adjustment aimed to reduce ammunition expenditure per claim and to maintain exit energy above 280, 320 kilometers per hour IAS to discourage pursuit. Claim validation remained under scrutiny even inside Finnish files. When ground confirmation was weak, claims were annotated as probable or damaged, affecting tallies used in post-mission summaries. Cross-check projects undertaken post-war and by contemporary researchers show that on certain dates, Finnish tallies exceed confirmed Soviet losses. On others, especially in dispersed low-level fights, Soviet records show losses with no matching Finnish claim. The historiography notes both over- and undercounts. Historiography, view, accredits Finnish methodical verification as unusually strict for the period. View B argues that systemic bias and fog of war still produced inflated ratios relative to actual VVS, attrition. The responsible approach in this narrative is to present the procedure and the ranges. Claims per ace rose markedly in 1,941.42 inches, LeLv 24. Exact one-to-one matches with VVS write-offs vary by day, engagement type, and reporting chain. In the second half of 1,941, LeLv 24 converted continuity and short-range basing into repeatable geometry fast high-angle attacks at 14 kilometers that conserved ammunition and pilot stamina. The result was high reported kill ratios, but contemporaneous Soviet records highlight discrepancies that make rigorous cross-checking essential to any assessment. January-June 1,942 Immola and Utti winter operations, maintenance discipline, and continuity effects. Dateline: January, June 1,942. Immola and Utti airfields, snowpack runways, engine tents, and short-legged scrambles defined the Brewster tempo as the continuation war moved into its second winter to spring cycle. The geographic picture barely changed. Front lines within tens of kilometers of Finnish bases, predictable approach corridors along the Karelian rail net, and interception altitudes still clustering around 14 kilometers. What changed was the unit's maturity. LeLv 24 entered 1,942 with a high proportion of veterans who had already flown 30-60 combat sorties since June 1941. Uncertain. Range varies by pilot. In a context where VVS rotations remained frequent, Finnish continuity was a rarity. Pilots often retained the same wingmen for months, and flight leaders carried over the same tactics refined in the autumn. The quantifiable footprint shows up in sortie density and serviceability. Monthly sortie rates for the Brewster Squadron continued in the dozens per airframe during winter months, with quiet week availability commonly reported in the 70–85% bracket, uncertain episodic dips during thaws and heavy snowfall. Cold weather penalties, longer preheat times, and careful throttle management on the Wright R-1820 were offset by meticulous ground routines that protected time between overhaul in the 200–300 hour range under Finnish practices, uncertain, engine variant, and year dependent. The winter's operational pattern centered on short-notice intercepts cued by ground observers and, increasingly, limited radar inputs where available. Typical mission durations in January–March 1942 remained in the 40–70-minute band, a function of proximate targets and cautious fuel margins for diversions. Ammunition economy remained doctrine. Convergence distances were individualized, often 150, 250 meters, and firing windows brief, with many reports noting sub-2-second bursts to avoid overheating guns and to conserve belts for reattacks. The weight savings of the Finnish B-239 on the order of 250-300 kilograms relative to naval standard fit kept wing loading acceptable for winter strips and low cloud bases. The machine allows a clean dive and a straight exit. Turning is limited to what preserves speed, appears in Aino Ilmari Jutalainen's notes from early 1942 paraphrase, pilot diary. That line encapsulated the Finnish preference to strike from advantage, disengage, and reclimb rather than contest prolonged horizontal turns. Winter basing and maintenance were not peripheral details. They were core to the claimed outcomes. Ground crews standardized insulation of engine tents, oil and fuel heating, and snow berm management to reduce foreign object ingestion on takeoff. Measurable effects included shorter cold start to taxi times, squeeze to minutes where heaters were staged, and reduced abort rates for misfires or gun feed issues. Uncertain, squadron-level logs suggest single-digit % aborts on well-prepared days. Serviceability at first light often determined the day's claim potential. 2 or 3 aircraft at 15-minute readiness could produce 4-8 sorties before noon if tracks appeared in sequence. Preparedness is the margin, reads a squadron maintenance summary attributed to early 1942 paraphrase. That margin mattered when VVS activity surged episodically, often tied to reconnaissance pushes or attempts to harass rail nodes around Viapuri and the Ladoga Rim. Claim validation processes, already formalized in 1941, hardened further. The winter's visibility, sometimes excellent in dry, clear air, sometimes degraded by snow, forced caution in awards. Where wreckage was not accessible, corroboration relied on wingman affidavits and any available ground observation. Finnish files increasingly graded outcomes: destroyed, probable, damaged. Historiographically, this remains contested ground. Post-war cross-checks show mixed alignment. On some January and March dates, Finnish destroyed claims exceed Soviet loss reports. On others, especially scattered, low-level skirmishes Soviet write-offs appear without a clean Finnish match. Records are incomplete and sometimes delayed. A VVS district memo acknowledged in early 1942 paraphrase, reminding analysts that confirmation depended on unit reporting cycles that could lag by days. The neutral reading is procedural. Finns applied relatively strict internal steps for the era. Fog of war effects and asymmetric documentation still produced discrepancies. Soviet counter-adaptations began to register in the spring. Increased escorting, wider altitude spreads, adding contact set to 3-4 kilometers when weather allowed, and the steady appearance of newer types, Log 3, early Yak 1, residual MiG 3, complicated the Brewster's favorite geometry. Finnish debriefs note more occasions when escorts appeared sooner, compressing the window for bounce attacks. Expect higher cover, a LeLv, 24 guidance line from April 1942, advised, paraphrase. In response, Finnish elements adjusted climb schedules to reach entry points 200, 300 meters higher than in late 1941, when warning time allowed, and they emphasized single, high-probability passes rather than multiple follow-throughs that risked entanglement. Engagement entry speeds cited in debriefs commonly remained in the 300-380 km per hour IAS range at 2-3 km, with recommended exit speeds above to 300 km per hour to deter pursuit. Continuity at the pilot level still underwrote outcomes. Aces such as Jutalainen and Hans Wind accumulated further credits in early 1942, though precise tallies per month vary by source and by how mixed-type victories are counted, uncertain. The structural point is constant practice against a familiar threat picture. Same fields, same lakes, same turns to the rail line. One Finnish after-action paraphrase summarized, capturing how terrain familiarity accelerated threat recognition and attack setup. The Brewster's cockpit ergonomics and visibility aided this learning curve, allowing quick scans for escorts and rapid alignment in the dive. Yet strain accumulated. Airframes logged high hours, and spares remained finite. Ground crews cannibalized when necessary, a practice that kept a core flight line viable, but left some hulls sidelined in hangars awaiting parts. By June 1942, the pattern's strengths and limits were both visible. Strengths: short transit, disciplined energy tactics, stable crews, and maintenance routines that preserved engines to their next overhaul bracket. Limits: increasing VVS altitude layering, better escort ratios on certain axes, and weather that could abruptly close the altitude band the Finns preferred. The quantitative deltas were modest, but real more fights, starting closer to 3-4 kilometers when clouds lifted, more instances of Finnish elements breaking off earlier to avoid multi-ship entanglements, and a subtle rise in ammunition expenditure per claim on some days. Uncertain, scattered log hints rather than a consolidated figure. "We will not trade certainty for numbers," a line attributed to a LeLv 24 flight leader noted in May, paraphrase, reaffirming that Doctrine prioritized assured shots over volume. Through winter and spring 1942, Finland's Brewster units converted continuity and meticulous maintenance into steady operational tempo at 14 kilometers, sustaining high claimed effectiveness. Soviet escort layering and type improvements began narrowing the window for bounce attacks, signaling that the Brewster edge would depend increasingly on precision and preparation rather than permissive geometry. December 1942, Ladoga, Isthmus corridor, claim verification, under pressure and Soviet counter-adaptation, dateline, December 1942, the Ladoga Rim and Karelian Isthmus, long summer light, intermittent low cloud, and an increasingly organized VVS changed both the tempo and the paperwork behind Finland's Brewster claims. With front lines still measured in tens of kilometers from Finnish bases, LeLv 24 and sister elements kept the same short-legged intercept pattern, but every stage from scramble to debrief tightened. Operationally, sortie density held in the same broad range, dozens of sorties per airframe per month in active weeks, while serviceability fluctuated between roughly 70–85% on prepared strips, uncertain, episodic dips during autumn rain. Engagement altitudes still clustered at 14 kilometers, yet VVS formations began to layer cover more consistently near to 3–4 kilometers when weather allowed, forcing Finnish elements to refine entry windows and break timings. The verification problem moved from a backroom task to a daily discipline. Finnish practice required, where possible, 2 independent confirmations for a destroyed credit wingman attestation, plus ground observation or physical wreckage. When wreckage lay beyond reach, gun camera film could substitute, although coverage in 1942 remained uneven. A growing share of claims therefore fell into probable or damaged, a categorization visible in mid-year squadron returns. Uncertain ratios vary by compilation. As a safeguard, duty officers started collating time grid references against observer posts to reduce double crediting. Time, place, witness, no exceptions, reads a duty note from late summer. Paraphrase, squadron admin log. The net effect was fewer uncontested destroyed awards per combat hour than in late 1941, even as experienced aces continued to accrue credits. Historiographically, Kari Stenman's archival compilations underline the method, stringent by contemporary standards, but still subject to fog of war noise. Paraphrase, Stenman. Soviet records from Leningrad Front air armies show the counterpoint lower loss counts on several days, where Finnish files carry multiple destroyed, and, conversely, some Soviet write-offs with no clear finish match when aircraft failed on return leg or were scuttled post-landing documentation gaps and timing lags measured in 24-72 hours. Tactically, the Brewster's strengths were unchanged but more narrowly exploitable. The Finnish B-239s to 250-300 kilograms empty weight reduction over naval standard fits preserved workable climb in the 1-3 kilometers band and steady handling in a high-speed dive. Doctrine kept firing windows short, often as less than 2 seconds per pass, with individualized convergence around 150-250 meters. Ammunition expenditure per claim remained difficult to pin precisely. A safe range in debriefs spans brief bursts under to 200 rounds, total to heavier use when escorts intervened. Uncertain. Logs vary. Typical entry speeds remained 380 kilometers per hour IAS at 2-3 kilometers, with exit speeds targeted above to 300 kilometers per hour to avoid entanglement. Break clean, climb to the sun, re-attack only with certainty. A line attributed to Eino Ilmari Jutalainen's notes recurred in autumn briefings, paraphrase 1942. Continuity in crews reinforced execution. Many pilots by now had 40-80 combat sorties since June. 1-9-4, one uncertain, range by pilot. And some leader-wingman pairs had flown together for months, reducing radio chatter and tightening visual cues. Soviet counter-adaptation timelines became visible in daily patterns. Increased frequency of escorts for reconnaissance and light bomber tracks reduced the Finns' bounce opportunities, while altitude spreads complicated single-pass tactics. A VVS sector digest from late 1942 summarized the change bluntly: maintain cover and avoid descending to the enemy's attack height. Paraphrase. Finnish responses were incremental rather than revolutionary. Earlier climbs from dispersal, adding 1-3 minutes to launch cycles, higher initial perch when warning time allowed, 200-300 meters more than summer 1941, and stricter abort criteria when entry geometry deteriorated. The cost was visible in the statistics. A marginal rise in aborts before firing, uncertain, single-digit percentage points, 2 and a slight increase in fuel consumed per intercept as elements extended climbs to clear top cover. Yet maintenance discipline kept the fleet turning. Time between overhaul for the Wright R-1820 remained in the rough to 200-300 hour bracket under Finnish practices, helped by conservative power settings and oil temperature management. Cannibalization continued as a means of sustaining a viable flight line. In return, commanders expected predictable, quick reaction windows, often 15 minutes from alert to wheels, up when observers called a track. Claim validation remained a contested bridge between operations and history. Within Finland's system, line pilots understood that a destroyed needed more than a plume of smoke and an optimistic tally. Write what you know, annotate what you think, appears in a late 1942 debrief instruction. Paraphrase. That tone, part caution, part institutional memory, coexisted with the reality that claims per ace still mounted. Jutalainen's cumulative credits across types moved upward in this period. Hans Wind and others added to Brewster. Era tallies before transitioning in later phases, uncertain. Monthly distribution varies by source. This is where cross-checking matters. Post-war efforts pairing dates, places, and unit rosters show that on some late summer engagements, Finnish destroyed claims exceed Soviet recorded losses, while on dispersed autumn skirmishes, the reverse appears: Soviet attrition with no single Finnish claim attached, likely due to multi-unit engagements or damage write-offs after forced landings. The historiography divides. View A. Finnish methods were stricter than many contemporaries and yield high but defensible ratios within the theater. View B. Even strict methods cannot fully offset confirmation bias and reporting asymmetries, so headline ratios must be treated as upper bounds. Weather and basing kept reshaping the margins. Late autumn rains degraded field conditions and braking, nudging serviceability downward and lengthening takeoff runs. Engine tents and fuel heating held the line as temperatures dropped, and the short taxi runway loops of forest strips minimized FOD risk. Quantitatively, readiness cycles stretched by minutes under cold start procedures, but aborts for gun feed issues fell where crews adopted standardized belt inspection. The small savings added up. 2 additional clean sorties across a day could put another 120–160 minutes of Brewster presence over the intercept boxes, a significant factor when VVS formations probed rail yards in predictable windows. Through the second half of 1942, the claim narrative sharpened but also narrowed. The Brewster Edge energy discipline, firing restraint, and veteran crews remained intact, but the VVS's altitude cover and steadier escorting compressed the Finns' shot windows. Verification tightened inside the Finnish system, yet discrepancies with Soviet loss reporting persisted, reminding analysts that any single number kill ratio is a simplification of a granular, time-dependent process. By late 1942, the Finnish Brewster system matured into a strict cycle: precise entry, brief fire, disciplined exit backed by formalized claim checks. Soviet altitude cover and escorts narrowed opportunities, keeping claimed ratios high in Finnish tallies, but increasingly bounded and contested in cross-verified records. January–December 1943, Karelian Isthmus continuity peaks, windows narrow. Dateline 1943, Karelian Isthmus, and Ladoga, approaches finely tuned Finnish routines, met a VVS that was heavier, higher, and increasingly disciplined. LeLv 24 kept its Brewster B-239 seconds on the front line throughout the year, even as other fighter units elsewhere in Finland began re-equipping with Messerschmitts. Uncertain. Timing varies by unit. LeLv 24 remained largely Brewster-equipped in 1943. The geography hardly changed. Intercept boxes typically 20–70 kilometers from home strips at Kymi, Utti, or Immola, with entry altitudes still clustering around 1–4 kilometers. What changed was density and timing. Summer brought longer light, enabling 2 to 4 sorties per pilot on peak days. Autumn returned low cloud, compressing engagements back into the 1–3 kilometers band. Maintenance remained. The fulcrum engine hour ledgers show the Wright R-1820 managed in conservative brackets, with time between overhaul kept in the rough tilde, 200–300 hours under Finnish practices, uncertain, engine variant, and usage. Serviceability, when weather cooperated, often sat in the 70–85% range, slush and leaf. Fall degraded that margin by single-digit percentage points as field conditions worsened. By 1943, the Brewster cadre had an unusual continuity signature. Many flight leaders had 6,100 combat sorties accrued since mid-1941, uncertain, range by pilot, and leader-wingman pairs often flew together month after month. That institutional memory kept Doctrine crisp: climb off axis, attack from advantage, fire for is less than 2 seconds at individualized convergence, often 150–250 meters, and exit above tilde 300 kilometers per hour IAS. Aino Ilmari Jutalainen's notes from this period repeat a familiar caution: keep energy, no unnecessary turns. Paraphrase 1943 diary extracts. The airframe itself, lightened by approximately 250–300 kilograms relative to naval standard F2A fits, remained just adequate for the 1–3 kilometers fight. Its benign handling and cockpit visibility supported disciplined gun passes. Its limits sustained climb and high-altitude performance, kept Finnish elements focused on geometry rather than prolonged maneuver. Claim procedures in 1943 reflected accumulated scrutiny. Duty officers emphasized corroboration, wingman statements, plus ground observer timings or wreckage, with gun, camera film invoked, where available, coverage still inconsistent. Write what is seen, grade what is uncertain. Reads a spring, 1940. 3 instruction, paraphrase, squadron administrative file. The result is a visible spread across destroyed, probable, and damaged entries in monthly returns. Uncertain. Proportions vary by compiler. Historiographically, Kari Stenman's compilations underscore that Finnish units were comparatively strict for the era, yet still vulnerable to fog of war flux. Paraphrase, Stenman. Cross-referencing to VVS lost documentation for the Leningrad divided by northern fronts continues to show asymmetries. On some days, Finnish destroyed outnumber Soviet recorded write-offs. On others, especially where aircraft force landed and were written off later, Soviet tallies exceed matching Finnish claims. A VVS digest line from mid-1943 captures the countermove: keep tight escort and avoid descending to the attacker's height. Regain altitude quickly after repel. Paraphrase, sector memo. Soviet counter-adaptation timelines became more concrete in 1943. Escorts appeared earlier, altitude spreads widened, with covers more consistently at to 3-4 kilometers when weather permitted. Newer types, LeLv divided by LeLv Farads, Yak-1B divided by Yak-7B, and the emerging Yak-9 series presented better climb at the Brewster's preferred bands. IL-2 formations more often carried dedicated fighter screens. Finnish adjustments were incremental but measurable. Earlier climbs from dispersal, adding to 1-3 minutes to launch cycles. Slightly higher perches, 200-300 meters above 1,941-42 norms when queuing allowed, and stricter abort criteria if entry, geometry, or ammo state was poor. The cost shows up in fuel and sortie accounting, a marginal increase in fuel consumed per intercept, and a small rise in pre-firing aborts, uncertain, single-digit % changes inferred from logs. Ammunition expenditure per claim remains resistant to one number. Safe ranges in debrief language still span sub-200 round bursts for clean bounces to much heavier use when escorts forced re-attacks, uncertain case dependent. Weather and basing still controlled the edges. Long summer days allowed staggered readiness 2 to 4 aircraft at 15-minute alert windows that could generate 6-10 sorties across a busy afternoon if tracks arrived in sequence. Autumn's low cloud lowered fights to 1-2 kilometers, where the Brewster's visibility and stable gun platform helped, but where the risk of stumbling into unseen cover increased. Ground crews retained engine tents, oil heating, and belt inspection rituals that shaved minutes off cold start cycles and reduced stoppages. Preparedness is the margin. A refrain from 1942 persisted in 1943 maintenance summaries, paraphrase. Quantitatively, those minutes added up. Across a month of active days, saving just 5-10 minutes on each launch cycle could yield multiple extra contacts, each with a non-zero probability of conversion into a claim. Pilot continuity versus rotation remained the core Finnish asymmetry, but its uniqueness was narrowing. By late 1943, VVS units in the sector showed steadier escort practice and indications of more stable pilot cadres, on some axes, uncertain, unit, dependent. Finnish debriefs noted fewer disorganized formations and more occasions when top cover reacted quickly to bounces. Expect prompt counterturn by cover, a summer guidance line warned, paraphrase. The statistical footprint is subtle, but telling. More engagements entered at to 3-4 kilometers when the weather cleared, fewer multi-pass attacks, and a growing emphasis on immediate egress if the first firing window was not optimal. In this context, aces continued to accumulate credits. Juutilainen's lifetime total across types crept toward the high double digits and beyond. Finnish crediting is greater than 90 across types by war's end. But the per-sortie conversion rate was increasingly gated by escort quality and altitude position rather than Brewster handling alone. The year's paperwork closes with the same caution that opened it. Finnish destroyed claims remained high for a unit flying an airframe often rated average on paper. Soviet records, meanwhile, document losses on timelines and categories that do not always map neatly to Finnish claims. The analyst's safe conclusion for 1943 is procedural. The Finnish system's continuity pilots, tactics, maintenance, preserved a high claimed effectiveness in a constrained theater. Simultaneous VVS improvements narrowed windows and pressed the Brewster units to harvest only the most certain shots. In 1943, Finnish Brewster units sustained high claimed effectiveness through veteran continuity, precise geometry, and disciplined maintenance, but Soviet escort practice and newer fighters tightened the envelope. The result is a pattern of fewer, more selective shots, strong for the Finns when geometry cooperated, increasingly contested when it did not. January-July 1944, Karelian Isthmus defensive phase, compressed geometry, and the end of the Brewster window. Dateline: January-July 1944. Karelian Isthmus and Ladoga approaches Finland shifted from a largely positional air defense to an urgent shield as the VVS prepared and then launched its summer offensive toward the isthmus. The theater remained narrow intercepts, typically 20-70 kilometers from bases such as Immola and Utti, but density and tempo changed. In the first half of 1944, several frontline Finnish fighter units accelerated re-equipment toward newer types, uncertain, unit-by-unit timelines, while remaining B-239 seconds continued to fly in secondary tasks, local defense, and gap-filling alerts. Where the Brewster appeared, it did so in a more hostile envelope. Escorts thicker, altitudes higher, 3-4 kilometers when weather allowed, and contact stacks deeper. Typical winter mission durations in January-March stayed within to 40-65 minutes due to fuel margins and cold weather preheats. By June's crisis, some scrambles shortened to 25-45 minutes as controllers prioritized quick climbs and rapid turnarounds between successive raids. Serviceability in winter calm still hovered near 70-85% for well-prepared strips, uncertain, episodic dips in thaw. But June's operational strain pushed that margin more cycles per day, more deferred, non-critical maintenance. The Brewster's known advantages, stability in the dive, visibility, and a Finnish empty weight reduction around 250-300 kilograms compared to naval standard F2A fits, were now set against sharper limits. Preferred engagement altitudes of 1-3 kilometers were less often available. Low cloud sometimes helped, but when ceilings lifted, VVS covers sat at to 3-4 kilometers above the B-239's comfortable climb band. Doctrine therefore tightened further. Climb off, axis, single high, probability pass, break clean, regain altitude if possible. Firing practice remained conservative sub-2 second bursts at personalized convergence, often 150-250 meters, because ammunition resupply and gun heating were acute constraints on multi-contact days. Certainty before volume, a LeLv guidance refrain, appears again in early 1944 briefs. Paraphrase. Yet more than doctrine had changed. Soviet escorts Yak-9 series, LeLv divided by LeLv farads were common. IL-2 boxes were often double-screened, and reaction times to bounces were shorter. A VVS sector memo from spring summarized the rule of the day. Cover shall not descend to the enemy's height. Maintain altitude advantage, paraphrase. That instruction directly attacked the Brewster recipe. Pilot continuity remained the Finnish differentiator, but its edge narrowed as storm centers moved. Many of the cadre who had built their tally in 1941-43 now flew newer types in the main effort, uncertain distribution by unit, while some Brewster flights persisted in local defense and training-cum-combat roles. Continuity still mattered even in these narrower assignments. The same leaders, the same routes, the same debrief cycle. Quantitatively, winter to spring sortie rates per still active B-239 airframe remained in the dozens per month on engaged weeks. By June, per airframe cycles could spike briefly when alarms stacked, even as overall Brewster exposure declined relative to 1,941.43 uncertain. Exact sortie counts vary by log. Engine hour management tried to hold the Wright R-1820 to a 200-300 hour time between overhaul envelope under Finnish practices, with oil temperature control and conservative power settings. June's pace strained that bracket, pulling cannibalization forward to keep a minimum number of airframes on 15-minute readiness. Claim validation, always a hinge in the narrative, tightened further under pressure. Duty officers leaned on the same triad wingman corroboration, ground witness, wreckage now complicated by fast-moving lines, and contested crash sites on the Isthmus in June. The paperwork result is visible in returns that show a heavier weighting toward probable and damaged when confirmation chains broke. Uncertain proportions differ by compiler. Historiographically, this is the month where discrepancies widen in both directions. Finnish destroyed credits sometimes exceed Soviet recorded write-offs for particular days with multi-unit melee. Elsewhere, Soviet losses, especially aircraft damaged and written off after forced landings, do not map neatly to a single Finnish claim. Analysts therefore treat late-period Brewster claims as bounded by context: fewer clean bounces, more interceptions inside layered escort, and compressed decision windows that made shooting discipline both vital and limiting. By June 1944, the defensive phase, cited in Finnish summaries, the geometry compressed. Controllers pushed intercepts closer to the target axes to maximize time on station. Typical initial contacts might occur 15-40 kilometers from base, rather than 30-70 kilometers. Entry speeds remained in the 300-380 kilometers per hour IAS range, at 2-3 kilometers when ceilings forced it lower. Where weather cleared, Finnish elements sometimes tried to reach to 3-4 kilometers, adding 1-3 minutes to climb and burning reserve fuel. Abort criteria tightened. If entry angle, escort spacing, or ammunition state were not favorable, elements broke off early to preserve the option for a second scramble within the hour. Do not trade survivability for a doubtful shot. A June instruction reads, paraphrase. Ammunition expenditure per claim in this environment trends upward. In scattered logs, reattacks were rarer, but escorts complicated single passes but remains difficult to reduce to a single figure. Uncertain, case-by-case variance. The human thread pilot continuity still produced outliers. Veterans who had internalized the energy template since 1941 could still harvest opportunities when weather pulled the fight down or when escort screens frayed. Aino Ilmari Juutilainen's overall wartime tally, across types, surpassed 90 by war's end in Finnish crediting. His diary extracts continue to stress the same core. Keep energy. Fire only when certain. Paraphrase. Kari Stenman's compilations, drawing on squadron diaries and after-action forms, foreground the system effects, warning nets, basing, stable leadership as the explanation for claimed ratios that remained favorable, even as absolute opportunities decreased. Paraphrase. Soviet documentation from the same period records both the attrition imposed by Finnish fighters and the success of altitude discipline in reducing losses when escorts resisted the temptation to descend. Paraphrase. Sector reports. Weather and basing, as ever, framed the edges. Winter preheats added minutes, but preserved engines. June dust and debris on stressed forest strips raised foreign object risks that crews mitigated with stricter taxi control and intake vigilance. The measurable deltas were small but cumulative. Shaving 3-5 minutes from cold start cycles with well-staged heaters could create one extra scramble window in a morning. Avoiding a single gun feed stoppage preserved a firing opportunity that otherwise would have been lost. Against a massed offensive, such marginal gains could not restore the permissive geometry of 1941-42, but they sustained a level of claimed effectiveness that fit the documentary pattern of Finland's air defense: narrow front, disciplined execution, and an airframe leveraged within its band. By mid-1944, the Brewster's window had largely closed. Finnish continuity and doctrine still produced selective successes, but Soviet altitude discipline and layered escorts compressed the geometry. In this defensive phase, claimed effectiveness persisted in narrow bands, while verification grew harder and opportunities fewer. July, September 1944, Karelian Isthmus crisis fighting, transitions, and retrospective ratios. Dateline: July. September 1944. Karelian Isthmus and Ladoga Rim. The Finnish Air Force fought through the heaviest ground crisis of the war and accelerated transitions that effectively ended the Brewster's frontline chapter. In June, the Soviet offensive had broken through portions of the isthmus. In July, August Finnish air controllers shortened intercept geometry even further to protect bridges, rail nodes, and retreat roads. Where Brewster B-239 still flew, they did so as local defense gap fillers alongside units increasingly equipped with Messerschmitts. Uncertain. Exact conversion dates vary by squadron. Typical contact distances compressed to 15-40 kilometers from base, and average engagements continued to sit at 2-3 kilometers when cloud ceilings were low. When weather cleared, VVS covers again occupied 3-4 kilometers, compelling Finnish elements either to climb longer, adding to 1-3 minutes in extra fuel, or to strike low and exit immediately. Operational metrics show stress and triage. Sortie cycles on peak days sometimes reached 2 or 3 per available Brewster pilot, but total Brewster exposure declined relative to 1941-43 as newer fighters took the main effort. Uncertain. Squadron logs differ. Serviceability for remaining B-239 seconds could still touch to 70-85% in calm weather, but June-July tempo and field wear pushed more maintenance deferrals into September. Engine hour ledgers tried to hold the Wright R-1820 to a 200-300 hour time between overhaul bracket by conservative power settings and oil temperature management. In practice, cannibalization for magnetos, plugs, and accessories increased to keep a minimum quick reaction line at 15-minute readiness. Ammunition discipline persisted. Convergence, individualized, often 150, 250 meters. Sub-2-second bursts preferred, with ammunition expenditure per claim trending upward in scattered logs when escorts forced rushed angles, uncertain, case-dependent. The verification system, always central to the Finnish narrative, faced its hardest test. Ground combat lines moved, wreckage zones were contested, and duty officers leaned on wingman affidavits and observer timings when physical confirmation was impossible. The paperwork signature is visible in late 1944 returns that weigh heavier toward probable and damaged, with destroyed reserved for clearer chains of evidence. Uncertain. Proportions vary by compiler. Kari Stenman's Archival compilations emphasize the structural reasons: collapsing distance, multi-unit melee, and more frequent mix-type actions complicate one-to-one matching with Soviet loss ledgers. Paraphrase. VVS sector notes from the same period point to altitude discipline and tighter escort drill. Maintain altitude cover, do not be lured down. Paraphrase. Sector Memo 1944. Those orders directly suppress the Brewster's long-standing bounce and exit advantage at 1-3 kilometers. Pilot continuity, Finland's most distinctive asymmetry since 1941, still mattered, but now as a retention of method rather than a source of numerous opportunities. Veterans with 80-120 combat sorties accrued since 1941 uncertain, range by pilot, could still convert a chance if weather pulled the fight down or if a formation strayed from its cover. Aino Ilmari Jutalainen's wartime total across types, credited in Finnish records at over 90 victories by war's end, stands as an outlier in this framework, built on the same principles he wrote repeatedly: keep energy, fire only when certain, paraphrase diary entries. The doctrine filtered into squadron culture, certainty before volume, a 1944 guidance refrain, appears again in late summer briefs, paraphrase. Yet, the aggregate effect across July-September was selective. Fewer clean bounces, shorter contact windows, and more aborted attacks when entry geometry was wrong. Exit speed still targeted is greater than 300 km per hour IAS to deter pursuit, but escorts reacted faster and higher, cutting off re-attacks. Quantitatively, the tactical picture hardened into two bands. In low cloud, engagements clustered at to 1.5–2.5 kilometers, where the Brewster's stability and visibility helped secure short, accurate bursts. In clear conditions, the decisive band moved up to 3–4 kilometers, where climb rate and power to weight left the B-239 disadvantaged against LeLv 5 Farads and Yak 9 covers. Finnish controllers tried to preload altitude by launching a few minutes earlier when warning time permitted, but that burned margins on short-legged strips and reduced loiter over the intercept box by several minutes per sortie. The cost-benefit math shows up in fuel ledgers, uncertain, scattered entries, which indicate slightly higher consumption per intercept in July, August compared to winter. The payoff was also probabilistic. Reaching 3–4 kilometers increased survival odds, but did not guarantee a shot if escorts held discipline. By September, the Brewster's operational role had narrowed to local defense, training, and opportunistic scrambles. The analytic question then becomes retrospective. Were the outlier claimed kill ratios of 1,941–43 mostly about airframe or about system? The evidence from 1,944 points squarely to system. The airframe, lighter by to 250–300 kilograms than naval standard fits, was leveraged within a constrained theater, but Finland's continuity of pilots, strict energy doctrine, short-range basing, and meticulous maintenance produced the statistically unusual claim outcomes. Once Soviet counter-adaptation's altitude cover, thicker escorts, steadier pilot cadres matured, the Brewster's window closed even though method and crews remained sound. Continuity proved its worth. The theater amplified it. Stenman's synthesis implies, paraphrase of archival commentary, the corollary visible in VVS records is that disciplined altitude separation reduced losses and eroded the Finns' preferred geometry, paraphrase, sector digests. Claim validation remains the historian's caveat. Cross-check projects pairing dates, grids, and unit rosters show alignment on some July-August days and divergence on others, driven by damaged versus destroyed definitions, delayed write-offs, and multi-unit claims. The safe analytic range is to treat Finnish 1,941–43 ratios as upper bounds requiring event-level matching, and to recognize 1,944 as the period when counter-adaptation narrowed those ratios, regardless of method. Integrity. Write what is seen, grade what is uncertain. A 1943 instruction repeated into 1944 remained the operational ethic, even as confirmations grew harder. Paraphrase. The summer crisis of 1944 compressed geometry and exposed the Brewster's limits even as Finnish continuity and doctrine held. High earlier claims look increasingly systemic products of training, basing, and method, while matured Soviet altitude discipline and escorts narrowed the advantage that once made the B-239 era an outlier. Autumn 1944, 1950 seconds, Helsinki and archive rooms after the guns fell silent. Finnish officers, researchers, and later historians reopened squadron diaries and VVS reports to test the outlier claim ratios that had defined the Brewster story. The chronology is clear. From June 1941 to mid-1944, LeLv 24 and associated flights operated in a narrow battle space, typically 20-70 kilometers from base, meeting most contacts between tilde 1-4 kilometers. Within that frame, continuity was a design choice. Finnish policy minimized rotations, leaving many leaders to accumulate 60-120 combat sorties in the same unit by 1944 uncertain. Range varies by pilot. The post-war question was whether that continuity and the doctrine it sustained explained the numbers more than the airframe did. The maintenance ledger provides one axis of explanation. Under Finnish practices, the Wright R-1820 was managed conservatively, with time between overhaul generally held in the to 200-300 engine-hour envelope, uncertain, year and variant dependent. Serviceability on prepared days often sat in the 70-85% band. Quick reaction targets of to 15 minutes from alert to wheels up were treated as a standard. Those two metrics, availability and reaction time, map directly to sortie density. Dozens of sorties per airframe per month in active phases, creating repeated contact against the same approach axes. On the airframe side, the empty weight reduction of roughly 250-300 kilograms in Finnish B-239 seconds, achieved by deleting naval equipment and other non-essentials, improved climb and handling in the 1-3 kilometers band, without altering the basic reality that, at higher altitudes, newer Soviet types would outclimb and out-accelerate it. Doctrine and training translated those margins into outcomes. Debriefs mandated individualized convergence, commonly to 150-250 meters, sub-2-second firing bursts, and exit speeds above to 300 kilometers per hour, IAS. Keep energy. Fire only when certain, Eino Ilmari Juutilainen wrote in diary notes repeated across 1,942-44 paraphrase. A corresponding staff refrain. Continuity is a force multiplier. Captures the institutional view. Same leaders, same wingmen. Same routes, same lessons. Post-war assessments that graphed claims against sortie counts and engagement bands found the same pattern section after section, high conversion when the fight stayed within 1-3 kilometers and the first pass was clean. Sharply reduced odds when escorts held 3-4 kilometers and refused to descend. Claim validation methods drew the heaviest scrutiny. Finnish practice required cross-checks, wingman corroboration plus either ground observation, wreckage, or, when available, gun camera frames, and graded outcomes as destroyed, divided by probable, divided by damaged, when certainty fell short. Even so, reconciliation with Soviet loss ledgers produced mixed alignment. Some days in 1941-42 show more Finnish destroyed than VVS recorded write-offs. Others show the reverse, when damaged aircraft were written off after forced landings, or when multiple Finnish units overlapped on the same wreck. A fair post-war synthesis placed the Finnish ratios at the high end of what a disciplined system in a constrained theater could produce credible within method, still subject to fog of war bias. Write what is seen, grade what is uncertain. A 1940 instruction that carried into 1944 became the methodological touchstone cited in archival commentary. Paraphrase. Counter-adaptation timelines, reconstructed from both sides' papers, explain the arc's narrowing. By late 1942 and through 1943-44, VVS escorts appeared earlier, held altitude at to 3-4 kilometers, and reacted faster to bounces. Sector memos stressed, maintain altitude cover, do not be lured down. Paraphrase. Finnish responses earlier climbs by to 1-3 minutes when warning permitted, slightly higher perches by to 200-300 meters, stricter abort criteria preserved survivability but reduced shot volume. Ammunition expenditure per claim, never reducible to one figure, trended upward in scattered logs when escorts shortened windows. The system still worked, veterans continued to post claims, and Jutalainen's credited wartime total surpassed 90 across types in Finnish records, but the Brewster-specific window closed as the decisive band moved up out of its comfort zone. Quantitatively, 3 anchors survive critical review. First, geometry. Most successful Brewster attacks occurred at to 1.53 kilometers entry, to 300-380 kilometers per hour IAS, with exit above to 300 kilometers per hour. Second, logistics. Serviceability in the to 70-85% bracket and engine TBO around to 200-300 hours enabled sustained contact cycles. Third, continuity. Non-rotation and repeated pairings compressed the learning loop and kept Doctrine consistent. Each of these is theater-dependent. Each degrades when front depth, altitude, or pilot churn increases. Thus, the analytic conclusion reaches past the airframe. The outlier ratios are best understood as outputs of a system that amplified small technical advantages and mitigated weaknesses through basing, maintenance, and training stability. The historiography remains bifurcated. View A credits Finnish verification as unusually strict for the era, arguing that high ratios are largely defensible when matched at event scale. View B cautions that any single headline number must be treated as an upper bound given definitional slippage and delayed write-offs in Soviet files. The disciplined answer is to hold both truths, a method that was indeed tighter than most contemporaries, and a documentary landscape that guarantees some divergence when matched across languages, units, and reporting cycles. In Finland's constrained 1941-44 theater, training continuity and tactical doctrine offset an average airframe, generating high claimed ratios that narrowed as VVS altitude discipline matured. The durable lesson is systemic. Basing, maintenance, and stable crews can temporarily outweigh paper specifications, but only within a bounded geometry and against an opponent still adapting.